Hi there everyone, this is International Master Mateusz Kolosowski from Poland. Some of you may already know me from some other content I've prepared for the Remote Chess Academy, and this time we're going to discuss Sicilian structures. So Sicilian is definitely one of the most important openings and also one of the most popular openings in chess at pretty much any level. So today we're going to discuss an aspect of Sicilian which I consider to be one of the most important ones. So the active play for black, meaning the typical pawn break using the d6 pawn to d5, or sometimes even pushing the pawn from d7 to d5 directly. So I hope you're going to enjoy it. I'm going to show you two games potentially if we have enough time, and I will also encourage you to participate as actively as you can, meaning that you can of course ask me any questions you feel relevant, and in case anything is unclear or the moves you don't consider the moves to be good enough, feel free to raise your hand and comment directly. Okay, so the first game I would like to present was a very important game from the perspective of history of chess. Robert Fischer, the world champion, against Petrossian, another world champion. They met in the candidate circle in 1971. Fischer, after beating people like Larsen and Taimanov 6-0, he was confidently approaching the final stages of the tournament, and at one point he met Petrossian, the former world champion, and let's see what happened. So there was e4, c5, knight f3, e6, d4, pawn takes d4, knight takes d4, a6 first, bishop d3, and now knight c6. So we have our Kan variation. Kan arises after a6 in this position. This is not to be confused with the also pretty similar variation which is called the Taimanov. Actually the opening I play myself, and I've played this myself for, well, years already. So instead of this, Petrossian opted for the more conventional, more, I would say, solid Kan. This was met with bishop d3, knight c6, and here Fischer opted for knight takes c6, b takes c6. And the first thing to understand, which is important to understand this position, is that black wanted to play a6 a moment ago to potentially in the future just move the pawn to b5 and develop the bishop to b7. So right now what white is trying to claim is that a6 was just a waste of time, and therefore it's beneficial to take on c6, forcing black to recapture with the pawn on c6. And this makes perfect sense to me, and this is actually one of the crucial, most critical ways of playing this opening. Here Fischer played kingside castle, and Petrossian directly replied with d5. And this is, as you probably already know, a common way of playing this structure with black. In general, black is more than happy to see such a powerful pawn triangle in the center, well, by occupying the center, you normally expect the position to be beneficial to you, to be promising, because you have lots of space, you can put your own pieces on good, nice spots. And Fischer, of course, recognized that. To a player like Fischer, this was more than clear that he needed to do something about the center. And now it's important for white to actually try to seize the advantage immediately in the center. So I was actually wondering if you have any suggestions for a move right now. Feel free to do that. Feel free to use the chat. I will also reply to comment on any messages you put there, so that you can test yourself and see if you actually played as Robert James Fischer. So at this point, Fischer played c4. Great move in my opinion. already hitting the pawn on d5, hitting the pawn on d5 with the other pawn as well, because if you just took on d5 directly, I think this is not that powerful. Black just recaptures on the pawn with the pawn on d5, and then he can continue to proceed with the regular development, and this seems to be, well, pretty much okay. So instead, increasing the center, increasing the presence in the center and creating even more tension in the center is much more advisable. And also, it is probably worth mentioning that in case black just directly took on e4, white takes with the bishop on e4. And speaking of the pawn structure, have a look. Would you be satisfied with such a pawn structure? Well, I don't think you should, right? Black has an isolated pawn on a6, isolated pawn on c6, and a pawn on e6 restricts the bishop on c8. So instead, it is really important for black to stick to this pawn formation that he has right now. But this is quite difficult because Fischer is already hinting at taking all of these pawns and opening the position. I saw some remark that the e5 was suggested. Right, if we push, I assume e5 was a reaction to d5. Such a direct release of the central control is normally not advisable. I don't think you should opt for that. Instead, let's also keep in mind the general principles of playing chess. So the black king is in the center, and therefore white just wants to open the position so that he gets access to the black king in the center. This makes perfect sense. So after c4, Petrossian had to bring some resources and protect all of these pawns in the center. So he played knight f6. And after knight f6, yes, again, this is sort of a question. What do we do right now? Do we play e5, just hitting the knight on f6? Do we exchange the pawns on d5, trying to open the position? And this is never an easy decision, to be honest. On the other hand, I think if you follow the general principles and understand that when the king is in the center, you need to open the position, it is going to be a bit easier for you to come up with the right decision at the very moment in a proper position on the board. What you need to know is that there is no universal response. Sometimes you may want to push e5, sometimes you may want to take on d5, and considering that Petrossian's king was in the center, Fischer took on d5, and this makes a lot of sense. This is, I think, clearly stronger than pushing e5 right now, because if you keep the position closed, well, Petrossian retains this pretty strong pawn center. Also, it's difficult to break through really with white, unless you have some pawn breaks, some pawn levers. Some pawn levers are needed to break through. So after c takes d5, Petrossian was forced to take back. E takes d5. And this is already, again, a bit of a problem for black, because if you take with the knight, yes, you still keep the position closed, but at the same time, white already opened the position to the extent that he's going to have a beneficial position. He's going to be able to bring some other resources to the game, maybe already queen g4, hitting the pawn on g7, preventing black from developing the bishop from f8. Oh, Chessbase Arabia, hello there. Is the hedgehog structure explained in the course? Yes, it is explained in the course, although in the full version. This time, in this stream, I will not be discussing hedgehog as such, but feel free to go to the... Well, the full course, actually, it is there. It is approximately 3 hours long, so there is actually quite a lot of content. Of course, you need to remember that hedgehog is just a pawn structure, and it's rich in content, and it would be pretty much impossible to cover every single detail, but yes, it is covered in the course. And let me let me actually paste it to the stream so that you get the direct link. You can use it and redeem your offer for a 50% discount. I think it's a great deal, honestly, and I stand by the content, really. Are you playing Chess-Base Arabia? So I think I'm referring to an organization instead of a player. Why Hedgehog? Why is the Hedgehog so interesting for you? I would be actually quite curious to know that. Is the closed Sicilian pawn structure covered in my course? That's a very good question. Even though I'm the author, at this point, yeah, let me double check that. It is not closed. It is not mentioned explicitly, but there are some ideas which are universal for the Sicilian, which are covered there. So even if you don't really, even if this is not covered by a separate chapter, you can definitely still use the knowledge that is there. There is many typical ideas, like for example the d6 d5 break, as we're also mentioning this today in the stream, but mainly the course is focused on the open Sicilian, so positions arising after knight f3 followed by d4. Okay, so let's move on. If black played e5, are we referring to this position? I'm sorry for any mispronunciation of the name, Sandra, Liao, or Kandra. I'm sorry for any mispronunciation. If black plays e5, if we are referring to this position, well, e5, it does attack the queen. I realize that this is probably the main intention here. That's sort of understandable to me. But at the same time, please note that this also exposes the black king, right? So white can even put the queen on g3 and have a look. The queen makes this double attack. It's a multi-purpose move. The queen keeps an eye on the pawn on e5. You need to react to this threat, and at the same time, you still cannot develop your pieces. And again, this is not the game continuation, because I think one of you mentioned that this game is breaking basic fundamental principles of playing in the opening, and I agree it would in this line. And Petrossian actually had to face the music, and he played e takes d5 because he considered this to be a more promising option, because he wanted to play bishop e7, and I'm sure he wanted to castle as quickly as possible. Okay, so this is what happened. Fischer just started. Well, he continued the development. He played knight c3. There was bishop e7, and at this point, you need to understand actually not only the typical Sicilian structures, but pawn structures in general. So the pawn on d5 is potentially weak, but it can also be an asset. Where will it be? When will it be weak? The weakness of an isolated pawn is in particular visible if there is an endgame. So if white managed only to exchange minor pieces, so the bishops and the knights, then it would be much easier for him to attack the pawn on d5. Generally, exchanges are favorable, and Fischer came up with a very interesting idea. He played queen a4 check, and this is a sort of a multi-purpose move, because at the same time, well, he had a couple of plans, I'm sure. One of the plan is, as I mentioned a moment ago, exchanging pieces so that there is an isolated pawn left on the d5 square in the center of the board. If this happens, black will need to protect the pawn with his pieces, and this is of course making those pieces less active because they need to perform defensive duties. So this is one idea. The other idea for Fischer is he can transfer the queen to d4. Keep in mind that blockading an isolated pawn is also a typical idea when you play against an isolated pawn. Also, quite a fancy queen transfer could be considered. You could play queen h4 so that in case black castles, which is pretty much going to happen any minute, then white could already use the queen for the attack on kingside. If black played bishop d7, what would have happened? I assume this is the question, the end of the question. Yes, this is certainly possible. I think Petrossian didn't like it because the bishop would still need to go there, go somewhere from the square. The bishop does not belong to d7. White can just go queen d4, blockading this pawn on d5, hitting it actually already with two pieces, bringing the bishop to the active g5 spot in the very next move. And as you see, the pawn on d5 already is a liability. It cannot escape. One of the typical plans when it comes down to playing with an isolated pawn is to push it forward. But okay, I think let's move on. This is a sideline. There's still a lot of content to be discussed today. And Petrossian played queen d7, and I'm wondering if you could suggest an idea for white at this point. Feel free to write in chat. I will try to answer your questions or concerns to the extent possible. So a moment ago I mentioned that a queen exchange is favorable, or a piece exchange is favorable. So would you take on d7? How to play right the opening in general, or this particular opening? If we are referring to general principles of playing the openings, I would say that you need to keep in mind just several guidelines, pieces of advice that will make your life easier. First of all, make sure you control the center with the pawns and with the pieces, right? So if you consider the moves that Grandmasters play at the very beginning of the game, they all try to occupy the very center of the board. So this is, strictly speaking, this area highlighted in red right now. Further, you want to develop your minor pieces, and this is in fact what we see right now. So the knight on c3, the bishop on d3, they are already developed. The knight on f6 and the bishop on e7 as well. So this is another thing that is needed and or advisable. And of course, you need to follow these principles if you want some entertainment from life, but generally what you want to do is to play according to the book and play as the best players in the world do, so by the principles. And also make sure you castle. That keeps your king safe. And also what great many people actually forget about, castling the king helps you to coordinate your pieces better, because then you are able to connect the rooks. Connection of the rooks is very important, and rooks are, after all, pretty strong pieces. Why would you not like to connect them? Okay, so I get some comments here. Exchanging queens. Yeah, this could definitely be done, and this is such a straightforward, nice move, right? But the difference between good players and really good players, really top players, is that a good player, when he sees the possibility to go for the favorable exchange, just goes for it. And a really strong player sees an exchange and says, okay, we're going to exchange, but on my conditions. And therefore, Fischer played rook e1, and you might be wondering, okay, what's the difference? And the difference is actually quite huge, because the exchange of queens is not going to escape, right? Black will take on a4, or otherwise white will take on d7. At the same time, if black castles, white just takes on d7, bishop d7, rook takes e7, white wins a piece. So from this perspective, rook e1 is a very strong idea. And I also saw yeah, Chess-Based Arabia, I will refer to your question in just a second. I also got some very interesting tactical ideas. Bishop b5, I do like it. I think Fischer was a little bit concerned that okay, it does win the exchange, let's be honest, because there is a pin here, black doesn't want to lose the queen, and he needs to take on b5, right? And after this, white just collects the rook, so it looks like everything is fine, and in fact white is even threatening to take on b5. The problem is this, I think Fischer just made a practical decision. He realized that after kingside castle, converting this advantage is perhaps not going to be as easy as it seems, because after all, black has a bishop pair. All of a sudden he controls the center of the board, I would say. He has the bishop pair. He might even come up with some sort of initiative after d4, bishop b7. If the bishop gets to b7, it will keep an eye on white's king. So I think Fischer was a little bit concerned about giving the opponent counter-attacking chances. He didn't like it. He didn't want to do that, and therefore he opted for the positional continuation. And Chess-Based Arabia, referring to your question, you made a fair point here. White has an advantage mainly because of the weakness of the d5 pawn. So as long as white manages to exchange pawns, or at least block this pawn, exchange pieces, and or alternatively just attack this pawn with as many pieces as possible, he will be able to well, engage all of white's pieces to attack, and also force black to defend, potentially win the pawn on d5. So this is one strategy, and in any case, in any scenario, this will be advantageous mainly due to the weakness of the d5 pawn. And the typical strategy, yes, it does involve exchanging minor pieces. Unfortunately for white, at this point, this does not seem to be all that possible, because well, if you just play bishop g5 instead, then well, you do not want to lose the bishop pair at the same time. So I think Fischer played in a very practical fashion. He realized some pieces are going to be exchanged, and well, in a moment you will see that he actually got a very promising position. Can I recommend a player for Najdorf and Italian game, please? Definitely, out of the really top players in the world, you have really many people playing the Najdorf. This is one of the most popular openings, popular variations, which is also quite heavy, and you need to learn it really well to play it at a decent level, but it is rewarding once you learn it. It is a very it is an opening that stands the test of time. But I would say you can study games of Maxim Wasilewski, or actually Polish players. Radek Wojtaszek is considered to be a great Najdorf specialist. Also, new generation, Jan Krzysztof Duda also played a couple of interesting games in the Najdorf, although I consider him to be a stronger player when it comes down to dealing with the Sveshnikov variation from white's perspective. So also just make sure you check the scope of the course that is there, that we're offering, and all of those most common, most popular, and considered to be the strongest openings are there, I mean variations. So in any case, coming back to the game, Petrossian felt that he just needed to capture here. And after this, after knight takes a4, bishop e6, bishop e3, we have typical moves aimed at finishing the development, and this is exactly what Chess-Based Arabia mentioned. At this point, I'm pretty sure Fischer was aiming to exchange some minor pieces, potentially by bishop c5 or even knight c5, hitting the pawn on a6. So we could probably already conclude that Petrossian opted for this typical d5 break And it sort of backfired, because this is not really the pawn structure that he wanted to achieve. And in a moment, once we finish discussing this game, I will show you what was the alternative for Petrossian, so that you don't get an impression that this line is going to be lost in any case. So Petrossian castled, there was bishop c5, rook e8 again. If bishop took on c5, if Petrossian took with the bishop on c5, then knight comes to c5 with a tempo. Let's maybe put this on the board for everyone to make sure that you actually see what's going on the board. This comes with a double attack, because the pawn on a6 is hit, and also white threatens to take on e6 right away, potentially recapturing on e6 with the rook, so white wins the pawn, and black is in fact forced to go back to c8. Hello Sitant Satao, I'm again, my apologies if I pronounce any of your names not correctly. Please do forgive me. I'm learning. Okay, so after bishop c5, there was rook f to e8. Rook f to e8, so Petrossian saw that there is some sort of improvement after the exchange. And Fischer just played b4. So at this point, he's not really interested even in attacking this pawn on d5. This is here about fixing the pawn on a6. I know the main topic of this stream is Sicilian structures, but I would just not be myself if I didn't explain something about the endgames. This is the principle of two weaknesses. So one weakness is clearly on the d5, right? So the pawn on d5 is weak, but at the same time, as you see, it is quite well protected. So there would be no point in even trying winning this at this point. Instead, Fischer wants to fix this pawn on a6. Let's maybe put it in blue. Is it in blue? It is in blue. Great. I'm an artist. So when you look at this pawn on a6, it is fixed right now. If black goes a5, white pushes b5, which results in a passer on b file, and any sort of an endgame would be already beneficial to white. So also black needs to keep a rook on a8 so that it protects the pawn on a6. And referring to a question in the chat, is bringing the rook to the game a possible idea? Always. I would really love to see this move on the board. This wasn't played, but again, Fischer was just trying to win a different way. This is a common pattern. When you don't know what to do, look at your worst placed piece and try to improve it. The rook on a8, on a1 is hardly doing anything, and therefore you might want to bring it to the game using c file. I like this move very much. On the other hand, if you consider that white wants to play on queen side, using potentially his pawn advantage, pawn majority, you could also consider the rook being useful later on if you start pushing these pawns forward, right? So I think Fischer wanted to be really flexible with his setup. And let's speed up a little bit, because there are still lots of things I wanted to show you today. So Petrossian just had to bring his pieces to defense, and therefore he played bishop c8. On the other hand, he activated his king. And maybe a bit of a question for you, chat: how many points do you consider the king to be worth in the endgame? So I know the king is considered to be immortal. It has no value. You cannot capture the king. Yes, we all know that. On the other hand, you can capture pieces with the king, right? You can capture pawns. So I'm quite curious. What, in your opinion, is the value of the king in the endgame? And we can argue about it in a moment. Okay, so there was f3 clearly controlling these two squares, preventing black from jumping to e4. Beautiful endgame technique by Fischer. 3.5. Okay, that's a fair answer. Anyone else? Rook e to a7, protecting pawn on a6, trying to release maybe the bishop from its defensive duties. Rook e5 was played. Just, you know, again, we are discussing two weaknesses at the same time, so bringing the rook to the attack of the pawn on d5 makes such a perfect sense. Bishop d7, knight d7, rook d7. Remember, even if you exchange a stronger piece for a weaker piece, the knight for a bishop in this instance, the most important thing is that what's left on the board. King is worth 9 points. No, no way, it's not worth 9 points. No, the queen is worth 9 points. Did you forget that there is a different piece which is so strong? No, I think I quite agree with Neil, if this is the way your name should be pronounced. My answer would be pretty similar. I would just say it's worth 4 points because it's a bit stronger than a minor piece, so a bishop and a knight, and weaker than a rook. So I would say it's 4 points, not 3.5, because I just don't really understand the concept of half points. In any case, rook c1, so finally bringing the rook to the action. Rook d6. Sorry, that. Oh, whoa, what happened here? No, we didn't want that. We didn't want that. That was a spoiler. Okay, rook c1 was played. I hope you didn't even notice that. Rook d6. You were reading chat, right? Rook c7. Activating the rook. And actually there is a separate course which we produced on rook play, on weaknesses in rook endgames. You may also want to look at it in your free time. Maybe there will be a separate stream on that. We'll see. For the time being, make sure you check that the link for the Sicilian works for you. The offer will be still valid for some time after the stream. I think it's actually 14th of July, right? So it's a bit longer than a week before my birthday. It would be really cool if you purchased those courses. Why 4? Because according to the rule of domination in chess, a piece is stronger than the other piece if it can dominate it, right? So rook is quite easily going to dominate the king. Rook, again, 5 points, is going to dominate the king because it will just cut it off along a file or a rank. If you see the white rooks right now, one rook is cutting the king along the e file, the other along the 7th rank. So it is dominating the king. It is stronger. So if we know the rook is worth 5 points, the king has to be worth less, right? At the same time, there is a king comparing to the knight. And if you consider the king versus the bishop, why is the king going to dominate the bishop, you might wonder? Well, remember that bishops can only move on one set of squares. So the bishop can only move on light squares, while the king can move on both light squares and dark squares. Yes, it will be slower than the bishop, but the king can always attack the bishop, and the bishop can attack the king only in several instances. King comparing the knight, well, if the king approaches the knight in a straight way, in a straight line, imagine the white king being on f5, the king would be able to make a tempo on the knight, and the knight cannot make a tempo on the king. It's a concept which is easier to discuss and describe when there's less pieces on the board, so I'm not really going to delve into that. I think you just need to trust me on this. Approximately 4 points. In any case, you see that link. I had some problems with pasting it, so but finally you can see the link to the course again. Again, I stand by the content. I think there is really good examples there, and it's anyone can find something valuable there. Knight is more valuable than bishops. I don't agree. I would say it depends. Okay, g6, king f2, h5. I will just quickly go through the endgame phase here. It's nice conversion, but it's not really the topic here. So Fischer activates the king, Petrossian at the same time. just needs to sit and wait, really. King d2. This is clearly a stronger piece. If you compare each and every piece of white versus each and every piece of black, it's clear white has the advantage. The knight has to sit on d7 so that it doesn't allow the rook to go to e7. The rook on a8 needs to protect the pawn on a6, and so does the rook on d6, which also protects all of the weaknesses that black has, which is probably currently a6, d4, and maybe also g6. You could argue about it, but at the same time, black has no active plan whatsoever. Why is bishop stronger than the knight? I wouldn't say bishop is stronger than the knight. I said it depends. So there are positions where the bishops are stronger and positions where knights are stronger. Bishops are typically stronger when there are pawns placed on two wings at the same time, because they can control those two wings at the same time. On the other hand, the knights are much better when there are pawns just placed on one wing, because then they can maneuver, jump from one square to another and control everything at the same time. So white played rook e2, e7 again. This is just an invitation to the other course I made on playing properly with the rooks. And there was just a couple of moves being made. King e8, rook b7 already. I think some of you may recognize the checkmate pattern that is about to be seen on the board. Knight f4 was played, bishop c4, so Petrossian won the pawn, but this is completely irrelevant in this case. The activity of the pieces is what matters the most. And black is left with this pawn on d4. It was weak for the entirety of the game. But what was actually important is that black had to adjust his play to to control the pawn on d5 and then later on to d4. On d4, he couldn't really spread his wings and play actively. In fact, Petrossian resigned after bishop c4. This might come as a surprise to some of you, but if you look at black's position, it is really miserable. And it's hard for black to play any move here. White is basically threatened to go rook h7 and then give checkmate. If you go knight e6, you just drop the knight after the fork, because the bishop also attacks the knight. I'm not really sure what else black could do here. There is also rook g7, rook g8, same idea. Black is really tied down on his last ranks, and this is not a nice position to play. And coming back to the opening, because this is actually where Petrossian made a grave mistake, because well, while you can play d5 here, there is also another plan to play e5, sort of trying to play against this bishop on d3. Right now it will be hitting the pawn on e4. Later on you might want to play bishop c5, put the knight on f6 and play pawn d6. This is another way of playing this position. And if you decide to go like Petrossian, like he did, go for d5, I think after c4 you actually need to be very careful. Perhaps the right move to be played here was d4. This is quite a risky decision, because white may still claim some space with e5, and then potentially he will have this beautiful bishop on d3, and black still needs to prove that he has some sort of play, active play in this position. I would actually not play this position with black pieces, so you have to actually be quite careful when playing b takes c6. There is an alternative though. There is also d takes c6, and again intending e5. This is also playable. Keep in mind that d5 is well, not all that glitters is gold. So d5, even though it's a typical break, you always should be interested in Sicilian. It's not going to solve all of your problems. And I think we could quite quickly go through the second game I've prepared for you. Feel free also to ask me any questions, maybe related more to Sicilian in general rather than this game, because this was just, again, a way to show you that you need to be careful in when you play d5, and this time I wanted to show you that d5 can actually be a good idea. So feel free to drop any questions in the chat. This time this is Karpov against Kasparov in one of the World Championship matches, 1985, and as I was mentioning before, a similar line to Can Sicilian, which was subject of the first game we saw, the Fischer Petrossian game. A similar line is knight c6, and this is, in great many instances, you get to transfer from one line to another. In fact, these transpositions are also mentioned in the course, so make sure you consult that. These are explained. And these are openings that are really important for me because I've been playing them pretty much for the entirety of my chess career. What is the basic motive behind Sicilian and the main idea we must have in our mind? Very good question. So Sicilian is, unlike, for example, playing e5, Sicilian is an opening where you play for an imbalanced position. So you mostly want to get, well, a counterplay directly, or prepare a more solid position and then strike when you're ready. So for instance, if you play the Najdorf Sicilian, you usually want to get immediate counterplay and play very actively. Sharp positions arise. This also applies to, for example, Sveshnikov variation, where you get a very imbalanced position. Perhaps, well, this is going to be maybe a better illustration of what I'm discussing. So Sveshnikov variation arises after these moves. This is also covered in the course. As you see, not a position that you see in all of the games. This is quite a popular variation, but black already makes a bit of a commitment. his d5 square is quite weak, but at the same time, black often gets his active play with a6, then b5, challenging the knights straight away. In the Najdorf Sicilian, you also get pretty active play. This could, one illustration is a line like that: knight c3, a6, bishop g5, e6. There's f4, bishop e7. For instance, queen f3 with very sharp play. Usually white castles queenside, black castles kingside, and we see people playing on opposite wings. On the other hand, there is Hedgehog Sicilian, there is Taimanov Sicilian, where you want to be when you want to have a bit of a more modest position and strike when you're ready. Hedgehog is basically, I believe this opening is named this way because it's referring to an animal. A hedgehog seems to be a very nice creature, but once it releases its quills, it can be very dangerous. So you want to look for either immediate counterplay in the center or counterplay in the center once you're ready. We're not trying to equalize, we're really trying to battle for the full point. Okay, so coming back to the game, I wanted to show you one line which is also quite important to understand. So white goes knight b5. This is on one hand breaking the principle of not moving the piece twice in the opening, but at the same time white just wants to occupy the d6 square. And understanding this pawn structure and the importance of the control over dark squares is the essence of actually playing this opening. You cannot really expect to survive playing the Sicilian unless you understand it. So it is quite crucial for black not to allow the knight on d6, and therefore d6 is required. And in fact, white could also play bishop f4, trying to hit the pawn on d6, and then again black needs to react with e5. So we have a bit of an interesting situation where white broke the rule of not playing with the same piece twice. First he moved the bishop to f4, first he moved the knight to d4 and then to b5. That was a waste of a move, a waste of tempo, and later on he played bishop f4 just to go back to e3. And this is why Sicilian is so interesting, because we have lots of imbalances. White tries to claim that the control over d5 square, so a weak spot in the center, is going to compensate him for this loss of time, and at the same time black just will try to prove that this was just a waste of time, and he was going to have a swift development with great equalization prospects. So let's see what happened. Karpov played knight b5, there was d6, c4, knight f6. Sicilian Dragon, yes, this is also a very sharp game, very sharp line, but it is covered also in the course, but I'm not showing this. This is not Sicilian Dragon. It's hard to say deep zero war, it's hard to say if this is dubious or not. I think this is leading to an equal game, but you need to understand that in chess, even though we are all trying to learn openings, at the end of the day, the evaluation of most of the openings is equality. But it's not the point. The point is that there are some positions with which every single player is going to feel better, he's going to feel more comfortable when playing those, rather than just playing some other positions. So it is very important to understand, you need to adjust the openings you play to your style. For example, if you're a sharp player, perhaps it's better for you to play the dragon, the knight, or some Sveshnikov. If you're okay with trying to equalize first and only then fight back, this, for instance, is my style, or at least was my style, then you could go for Taimanov, for the classical Sicilian, for some other setups, which also don't involve the necessity to learn all that much theory. But in any case, this is a critical position of this game, because again we are discussing classical d5 break, and in this particular position this is a legitimate pawn sacrifice. And you normally see it a bit later on in the game, but Kasparov, he just felt very comfortable in playing those sharp positions with great many imbalances against any opposition, and that's why he opted for a direct d5 pawn sacrifice. And let's keep that in mind. Kasparov was always considered to be a great, creative, tactical, sharp player, and Karpov has always been the master of strategy, endgame technique, positional chess. So it's a fight of a fire against fire with water, fire against water. It's a battle of the elements, and I think from Kasparov's perspective, d5 is a perfectly logical move. And in fact, in a moment, Karpov made his first mistake. So there was c takes d5, e takes d5, e takes d5, knight b4, already trying to retain the pawn. Sandra Liao, is it good to play theory like Sicilian or not to play theory? In long run, if you want to make progress, definitely play the theory. Yes, it does involve learning. You need to learn lines, you need to memorize lines, but it will be rewarding. You will end up in a situation when you get really promising positions. You don't have any opening problems. It is actually your opponents that struggle when playing against you in the openings. So you always start with a bit of an edge. When you play dubious openings, you will not only lose many games because you just don't really play properly in the opening and your opponents manage to get straight opening advantage against you, but also you will just find yourself in positions that are maybe not that promising, and you will mainly count on tactics instead of going for a tested, reliable opening, such as Sicilian. But of course, you also need to put some effort into understanding, and therefore, well, spending some time on understanding. I look good with a beard, thanks a lot. That's a nice compliment. It was longer a moment ago. A couple of weeks ago it was much longer due to COVID situation. But in any case, coming back to chess, spending time not only on memorization of lines is important, and also understanding of the structures and lines you play is perhaps even more important. You don't need to always memorize everything, but if you understand the concepts, common ideas, the ways you should be playing. So, for instance, if you know that you are generally required to find a d5 break in your position, you will do everything to try to get this d5 break. If you instead just try to memorize the moves, your opponent will change something, even a minor thing in the opening, just preventing one of your ideas, and you will end up in a position you don't understand. So understanding should come before memorization. So coming back to the game, I think this is quite a sufficient reply, wasn't it? This was already a bit of a lecture. And guys, it's pretty much impossible to tell you every single secret of learning chess and playing properly the openings within an hour. You really need to buy this course. There's more than I'm telling you this right now. This is just an executive summary, so I'm trying to fit as many advice as I can within an hour. So bishop e2 was played, and we see a typical Sicilian situation. A pawn sacrificed, but at the same time, active piece, active piece, active piece. This is what we love about Sicilian. It's such an entertaining opening. You get to play such fresh, unconventional positions in great many situations. And here Karpov made the first mistake, or inaccuracy, you could argue. He played kingside castle, which is a bit of a modest reply, and instead it was necessary to try to keep this pawn on the board for as long as possible with bishop e3. And for instance, after the exchange, there is queen a4 check in between move, which enables white to recapture the knight, and that generally, after some complex moves, this ends with a bit of an advantage for white. Scheveningen, I didn't mention that, you're right, Chess-Base Arabia, fair point. I consider Scheveningen to be a bit of a underestimated line, although the theory has been developed there, and I think people were trying to find some new fresh ideas and they struggled there. I think black is okay in Scheveningen. You just need to be okay with playing the hedgehog. So indirectly I did mention Scheveningen Sicilian by referring to the hedgehog itself. So the structure where you have e6, d6, b6, a6. In Scheveningen you mostly have b5, but this is this is actually something I started playing when I was a bit younger, and I can totally recommend it. So after castles, black castled, white played bishop f3. There was a question, why not exchange? Why not taking on d5? I think it is possible to take right now, right? There is no problem with taking this, but the issue is that Kasparov is right now behind in development, so he just didn't want to do that. And later on, yeah, he castled, which enabled him to catch up in development and at the same time bring even more resources. Typical Kasparov play. These pieces are protecting the pawn, but they are also restricted to performing this function. This is just defense. So bishop g5, rook e8, and as you see, pretty much every piece is involved already in the game. Queen d2 was played, and now b5. Yes, Kasparov is down a pawn, but just look at this miserable knight on a3. What is also going also the knight on c3 doing? At the same time, black is planning to go bishop d3 or even knight d3, putting even more pressure on the pawn on f2. Potentially even queen b6, hitting the pawn on f2. The pawn doesn't matter at all in this case. Rook a to d1, knight d3 as mentioned, knight a to b1, and this is the proper mistake that was made by Karpov. Let me just very quickly go through the upcoming moves because well, there's been many moves there, but you will see in a moment how Kasparov sees the advantage, and this is actually the most important part of the game. So there was bishop h4, b4, knight a4. Have a look at those knights. If this costs you a pawn, this is a real bargain. You should go for such an offer any moment of the day. If you manage to restrict your opponent's pieces like that, just go for it, even if it costs you a pawn. So bishop d6, bishop g3, trying to simplify a little bit and get some fresh air into the position. Rook c8. Last piece comes to action. Remember, your position is as strong as your worst placed piece. So I think black's position is pretty good right now, because I don't see a bad piece. b3 was played, g5, claiming even more space on the king side. Let's just maybe play a couple of moves more. Takes, g3, knight d7. This is a nice maneuver, transferring the knight to king side. Why not bishop d4? At which point? I'm not really sure how you could go bishop d4. So after the exchange, knight d7, bishop g2, queen f6, a3, a5. Some simplification. As you see, Kasparov doesn't even want to take this pawn. It's so pointless to take it. Finally, he did that. And this was pretty much crushing. I know I'm playing those moves quite quickly right now, but Karpov just had to pretty much move on the back ranks, and Kasparov just had full flexibility, mainly because of these poor knights, and they had to go there because of white's dominating position in the center. At some point like this, Kasparov won the material. Nice trick. If rook takes e3, there is rook takes d1, and only then rook takes e3, and white loses material. And somewhere here, Karpov just resigned. I know this was real quick, but the most, yeah, exactly, that knight on d3. The most important moment was just to show you how quickly Kasparov released his pieces, and this is the beauty of Sicilian. You don't always even try to recapture the pawn on d5. You just make this pawn break to get space, to bring fresh air to your pieces, to make it to make them as active basically as you can. Pawns is not the only thing that matters in chess. So what do you think, guys? Is Sicilian a good opening? Do you play? Does anyone even of you play this opening on a regular basis? Or are you just curious because you don't know if you want to buy the course, or if you should just maybe wait a little bit until we release another course on Rai Lopez? Any thoughts? Remember, the offer is valid for well, a couple of days more. You will be able to use the code even after the end of the stream, but well, make sure you you take a look at that. There is as many as, what was it, 12 chapters? No, 10 chapters, sorry, but 10 is still enough. I mean, some details are shown between particular pawn structures which could arise after the most popular lines, such as Najdorf, Scheveningen, Taimanov, Khan, Sveshnikov, the Dragon. So really, extensive course. You will probably find it difficult to find something comparable in the internet, not to mention books. This is really action-packed, and basically the aim was to give you an indication of different possibilities you may have in the Sicilian, because this is an opening which is considered to be great, interesting, and many people play it, but not many people actually realize that there are great many different lines, and you may still, even if you don't feel that great about super sharp positions, you may still enjoy playing the Sicilian, especially if you understand what needs to be done. And I believe that understanding the essential pawn structures is the essence, is the core of understanding. If you know what needs to be done about your pawn structure, you basically understand your entire position. Plus some tactics, because tactics is also important. Right, guys, any last portion of interesting questions? I would be happy to answer that. You also see probably in the chat, you see the link to the course. Honestly, the only reason why I'm not buying it is that because I made it. True story. Right, so if there's no questions, I guess we will be going. I hope you enjoyed it, and thumbs up if you want me to stream in cooperation with Remote Chess Academy once more on another day. Why is neither of the best? I'm not really sure. Now, honestly, there is one answer. If you learn the neither properly, you have pretty much 100% of chance that you will not get a worse position. Yes, a positional player such as me can play Sicilian. I play Taimanov and Khan, and once I started to understand what needs to be done in those openings, I forgot great many lines, guys. It's even shameful how many lines I forgot throughout my chess career, but I still remembered the ideas, and that helped me a lot. In any case, thanks for this stream. It was nice to meet you, and I hope to see you some other day. And